Now when it comes to 2025, we're starting the year off at a very action-packed point for the series. We're just getting started with the Busan saga, and there's a whole bunch of mysteries yet to be unveiled by PTJ, along with a vast array of events and things we're expecting to happen that didn't take place last year. So I've gone ahead and made a bingo card. Well, it's not really a bingo card because there's only 4 columns and 4 rows, so it's more like a bing card, which you get the gist. And this card pretty much sums up all of my predictions for things I'd like to see in 2025 for Lookism. Now when the year ends and we're about to jump into 2026, I'll look back on this video and see if we managed to scratch any of the 4 squares in a row, whether it be vertically or horizontally or even diagonally, and therefore we would have achieved a successful bing. Now without further ado, let me go over the 16 predictions I've placed on this card for things to take place in 2025. The first one of these is the pre-generation arc. Now the pre-generation arc is something that I've gone over previously, and this isn't really my first time mentioning it, but I think we can all agree seeing the story of Gaprion Kim and the generation he gathered would be a game changer for all of us. As a matter of fact, a couple of months ago when PTJ was attending a certain event for manhwa and specifically Lookism, he mentioned 2 things that would take place soon in the story at that time. PTJ mentioned that Gi-tae Kim would be making a return to the story, and this was before we had seen him officially make a return to South Korea, and he also mentioned that the pre-generation arc would be coming very soon. Now something intriguing about this is that after he mentioned the pre-generation arc taking place soon in the story, we actually had an arc very similar to that, where we witnessed Gun's childhood and his backstory pretty much, and more specifically we witnessed the fallout of the Yamazaki clan with the death of Shingen and so on, but we never really got to see Gaprion Kim's side of the story. We never saw any of the members of the pre-generation in their prime. As a matter of fact, we only saw a lethargic version of Shingen, and the one time we saw Gaprion, he was already old and seemingly in pursuit of politics. So this poses the question, when PTJ mentioned the pre-generation arc, was he referring to what we ended up seeing as the Shiro Oni backstory, and if so, are we never gonna see the story of the pre-generation and Gaprion Kim in their primes? And if not, then when exactly are we gonna be seeing that pre-generation arc, as it's been months since he's made that little announcement? And would it be better to see it in the main story as a 20 to 30 chapter arc or a complete one-off series on the side? I've placed this arc on my bingo card because it's something I anticipate in the year of 2025, and to be honest, I prefer it being a one-off similar to the story of Manager Kim, as I feel like it would be insufficient to turn it into a small arc and skip over the important details of the actual pre-generation. Next up, we have the Gu Kim backstory, and this is something I've actually made a video on. You can check it out after watching this one if you want to. In that video, I pretty much went over the connotations behind Gu Kim's whole Hwarang sword shenanigans and how it's a sword that stabbed its own master and so on, and how the Hwarang Knights were actually a real part of history and aren't just a myth. And I'm gonna keep it real with you guys, I don't fully recall everything I said in that video, so if you wanna know more about the potential outcome of Gu Kim's backstory, you can check that video out. Anyway, Gu Kim's backstory is something I'm very eagerly anticipating for this coming year of Lookism. Now, allies surpassing their masters. This was a prediction I actually received from Frosty over on Discord as a suggestion to add it onto my bingo card, and I'm not gonna lie, it did catch me off guard, but that wasn't because it was unlikely, it was because I was surprised to have brushed over something so significant. The members of Allied are currently heading into a whole entire brand new saga when it comes to the story of Lookism, momentarily attempting to take down Busan, who I'm theorizing aren't the actual villains of this saga, and they're also most likely gonna have to end up facing James and Gi-tae and their whole entire army of probably fucking Mexicans. So I do see them needing another upscale in order to be able to take down this obstacle which lies in their way, and I think if they do get another upscale, it's gonna have to be them surpassing their masters, because if James and Gi-tae are the people standing in their way, 2 individuals who their masters couldn't even take down, this really only makes sense, and I think it's likely gonna take place in 2025. Next, we have the red paper reveal. Now honestly, I was slightly iffy about this placement due to the fact that Charles Choi is dead right now, meaning there isn't really a need for the red paper reveal anymore. However, I still think it would be something cool to see in the coming year, maybe just as a little side reveal, though I wouldn't count on it being a deciding factor in whether or not I get to successfully achieve a bing on this card. Moving on to the second row, we have Vinjin versus Taejin. Honestly bro, if Vinjin doesn't end up getting his get back on Taejin this year, the man who literally got his master killed and also damn near raped Sujin before killing her, I do not think he's leaving Fraud Watch forever. Vinjin better get the fuck to training and start putting that grip strength to use, because Taejin is a guilty man on the run right now, and Vin is the only man who can justifiably crash out and be his judge. I really hope this happens in 2025. Next, we have James vs Gun, a matchup I recently made a video on, which has been hyped for more than 100 chapters now, since all the way back in the Hunt for Big Deal when they had their little angel versus demon face off. I'm gonna be honest with you guys, I don't think this is it for Gun here. I really don't think so. With how much we know PTJ loves Gun, which we clearly saw in the Hunt for Gun when he mopped the floor with damn near the entire universe, I don't think PTJ is ready to let go of him yet. I think the reason he's deciding to put him in jail is merely to build up suspense for when he eventually does make a return, and And besides, how are you gonna manage to keep Gun, one of the strongest individuals in the whole entire world, in a regular jail cell? This guy is so overpowered he can literally fucking fly. The way I see this going down is that if my theory ends up being true, and James truly is the main villain of this arc and has been manipulating Daniel the entire time to take down the good guys, in other words, Jinrang and the whole of Busan, then James is gonna capitalize on this opportunity, and once Daniel and the others are weakened and unable to take down James and Gite, when they find out they've been fighting on the wrong side the whole time, that's when Gun is gonna make his grand appearance to save their asses from James. Low-key though, I don't see how he'd be able to take down James and Gite at the same time, so if PTJ decides to go down that route, we're probably gonna have to have someone else make an appearance. Now for the 7th spot on this bingo card, I mentioned Charles Choi's backstory, and yes, I'm aware the man is literally deceased, but so is Gapryong, and those two are probably the most significant members of the P-generation when it comes to the unfolding of the events of Lookism, and I think it's only fair that if we do end up receiving a full-fledged P-generation arc, we would witness Charles Choi's story as well. Now let's move on to the final spot on the second row, which is Daniel mastering his Ultra Instinct. This is something that has been mentioned multiple times in the series by now, I'm pretty sure, and it's something that could really take Daniel from the massive threat he is right now, who is unfortunately subject to the lethal weakness of the Paradox of Perfection, to who I believe will be the strongest man in the verse ever, only if he manages to master Ultra Instinct. I mentioned earlier how I don't see how Gun can take down the both of James and Gite if he does end up coming back, but now that I think about it, this could be a really good way to finally make Daniel not only master Ultra Instinct, but go up against Gite, for example, while Gun goes up against James, in a last-ditch effort to save the second generation from the atrocity they've just committed, which is taking down their allies. And also it would be really cool to see a 2v2 between two people who have mastered different versions of Ultra Instinct, and the other two people who have absolutely terrorized the first generation with their own unique fighting styles. I don't really know what to say about this other than this is something I desperately want to see. I want to know more about James and how he grew up and was seemingly raised by Charles Choi and so on and so forth, and I want to see what kind of fights he had before his fight with Seong-ji, and I think he's just a really interesting character which we don't know nearly enough about yet, having the status of the potential main and final villain of this whole entire series. The next prediction is one which I think is the most likely on this whole entire bingo card to take place, which is Jinrang's backstory, and I merely put it there because it's gonna be an easy thing to scratch off, and I'd be surprised if it didn't end up happening. I mean, come on, we're in Busan, he's allegedly the main villain of this arc, it would only make sense if we had his backstory, right? Alright, this one might be by far the most surprising prediction I placed on this bingo card, which is a rematch between Gun and Gu, in which Gu ends up being the victor. This is a prediction I took from my good friend Poku on Discord, which I've also seen some other people talk about on the Reddit as well, and I've also seen Gradient, another Lookism YouTuber, mention this in one of his community posts, and it's also assuming that Gun would make a return to the story, which I think would only make sense, but it basically takes up the premise that since this whole Hwarang sword thing was mentioned to be able to cut down even goblins, and Gun was referred to as a goblin at a very close point to the mentioning of the Hwarang sword as well, which I've discussed in my Gu's backstory video that I brought up earlier on in the video. This could be PTJ implying that with the Hwarang sword, Gu could get a major upscale and eventually take down Gun in his YUI state. Now for the truth behind Gapryong's death, I'm not really gonna go over this too much in detail because it's something that I think is relatively self-explanatory. Either we get the P-generation arc and it ends with Gapryong being killed by James and Gite, or in the process of taking down James and Gite, we get the truth behind Gapryong Kim's death. Either way, this is something that I think is much more likely to happen than not, and it's also likely to take place sometime this year, I hope. The final row starts with Gite Kim's story, which is something I'd like to see just as much as James Lee's story, and I see this as likely to happen but unlikely to happen in 2025 because I feel like it would probably take up a good chunk of the year, similar to Jake Kim's backstory. Regardless though, it's something I really want to see, and if it happens this year, then hey, that's another spot I can scratch off in a prediction I got right. Jae-gyun's story is actually really interesting, mainly because he's pretty much the most ambiguous member the first generation kings ever revealed. We know nothing about the guy other than he dyed his hair and he's the king of Incheon, and there's a theory that he may have been affiliated with Jinrang, which I mentioned in my latest vid. It basically holds the premise that since he has a scar on his right hand, and specifically his middle finger, which is the same spot Jinrang's gang puts their rings, he may have been a member of the gang but left when Jinrang went to prison, but I guess we'll never know until we finally see his story. I mean, I hope this happens this year, but if it doesn't happen, then I wouldn't be too disappointed because there's much more interesting things on this bingo card. Now the penultimate spot is Jinrang versus Gite. This would probably be the most hype fight of the year if it did end up happening in 2025, as Gapryong's son versus Gapryong's disciple is something I think the entire fanbase wants to see, and it's actually the most likely fight for Jinrang other than UI Daniel as of right now, and it would be even more enjoyable than Jinrang versus UI Daniel, I'm not gonna lie. And honestly, if this does end up happening this year, even though it would go against other possibilities such as Gun coming back to save the second generation, I still wouldn't be mad because I'm always up for a hype fight no matter the circumstance. Now the last one is a bit anticlimactic, I'm not sure why I even put this on this spot, but we have Mujin's story. When I say a pre-generation arc is expected, I don't mean an arc where we simply see how Gapryong gathered the pre-generation. No, I mean an entire saga going through every event that took place inside of the pre-generation, which is why I'm saying it would be better as a one-off, because if Lookism has gone on for this long and we're still not done with the story of the second generation, how would PTJ ever be able to fit the pre-generation saga into a mere 20 to 30 chapter arc?